Hey, what's up, Optimal Health Nation, and welcome to episode 40 of the Optimal Health Show. In this week's podcast, I got my good friend John Kiefer to drop by and talk about how to get a sexy body with carb backloading on a tight budget. Now, John Kiefer is an exercise scientist, nutrition expert, and the author of the new book, Carb Backloading. John applies his knowledge from a career in physics to back up the human body for fat loss, muscle gain, and improved performance. He's also the author of Carb Night Solution and is releasing his brand new book really soon. Now, before we actually get to today's episode, I got a couple of things. First, this week's Optimal Health Warrior shout out goes to Rory Linehan. Rory, you're doing an amazing job, brother. Keep it up. As well, email me so you can get your free gift. Now, to the fun part, the warrior quote for this week. We do not rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. Now, this is an old Chinese proverb. And what this means is you have to strive on a day-to-day basis to be your best. When we fail, it's usually because we are lacking skill. But the only way to actually create skill, whether that is your top performing athlete, an entrepreneur, a coach, a mother, a father, these skill sets, the only way you actually achieve them is small things on a day-to-day basis. So if you want to become healthy for the rest of your life, you have to change your habits on a day-to-day basis. If you want to be a high-performing entrepreneur, you have to change your habits on a day-to-day basis. I truly believe if we live this way, and if we actually embrace this quote, our lives will become much better. So without further ado, please sit back and relax and enjoy today's amazing podcast with John Kiefer. Hey Kiefer, how you doing, brother?
Pretty good. How are you today, Ameer?
I'm good. I just want to thank you for coming on the show today and educating us about carb backloading. I think I first heard about you, maybe it was like 2 years ago. I forget what podcast was, or maybe it was a blog article I was reading about. And I'm like, what in the world is this crazy guy talking about? I'm like, wait a second, eating all this food at nighttime? And I was kind of like astonished and blown away about it because the modern day paradigm has you thinking in the opposite way, that you actually need carbs almost at every single meal, and that carbs are the only single thing that's going to like increase, hypertrophic growth. So I'm really curious, how in the world did you stumble across this scientific literature?
I don't know if all of it would be, if stumble across would be the right word. I mean, by the time I'd come up with carb backloading, I'd been looking at medical research for, at least 15, 16 years at that point. So I had a pretty good foundation. And what I'd been experimenting with was trying to gain muscle mass while on a ketogenic diet, which I just really could not accomplish. I was able to get incredible density and very lean, but I just was stuck. And my strength was great. I just really couldn't put on any muscle mass. And I'd remembered a couple, and my problem has always been when I eat carbs, in a lot of places, I'll easily start holding some body fat. My stomach will get soft. Carbs have just never been my friends. But I remembered this article about diabetics and how in type 2 diabetics who were completely insulin insensitive, so insulin no longer had any ability to help their muscles absorb carbohydrates, that after resistance training, they were actually able to clear blood glucose to normal levels and still remained insulin insensitive. And I just, I thought this was really interesting. And so I really looked into what the mechanisms were there. And that's when I learned about glucose transportation and how there's a whole family of glucose transporters. They're called the GLUT transporter family. Basically, there's essentially 14 now, maybe they've identified. Anyway, and the important one in muscle and fat tissue, it turns out it's the same type of GLUT transporter. It's GLUT4, and that is predominantly turned on by insulin. And what's interesting is, whenever you ingest carbohydrates, the only two tissues that are really influenced as far as using carbohydrates because of the insulin that's present is fat tissue and muscle tissue. So that kind of led me to a clue of why, whenever I had carbohydrates, my muscles would refuel, but my fat cells also would too. And I would, hold water, get softer. And so I was thinking, if type 2 diabetics could get away with this, that humans, healthy humans, it's very clear to talk about healthy humans. Healthy humans are insulin sensitive in the morning, which means both fat and muscle can absorb carbohydrates, and more insulin resistant at night, which means it's harder for muscle and fat to absorb carbohydrates. So I figured if my training were anytime in the evening hours, so say 2 o'clock or later, that I could essentially, my fat cells would still not want to store carbohydrates because they would be more insulin resistant. But my muscle cells now, it didn't matter that they were insulin resistant because they could absorb sugar because I worked out. So I kept tweaking and looking at more of the science to get the timing down and all that kind of stuff. And, I started using it on myself. I got great results. People were asking me what I was doing in the gym. They thought I was getting ready for a competition. So I told them, I got some friends doing it, and then I got some powerlifters doing it, and then some strongman competitors, and then some bodybuilders. And, it's just gone on from there to even there's a Dr. Rocky Patel in Phoenix, where I currently live, is using it with his patients to help them with manage their diabetes and everything. So it just kind of grew organically, but the way I discovered it was really out of some, oddly enough, diabetic research that tipped me off on a direction to study.
That's amazing. Now, what is the main mechanisms going on? Because you're talking about having the carbs later in the evening opposed to in the morning, and you just mentioned the difference between the muscle cells and the fat cells. Now, on top of that, you also hit on something very important. It is very important when you work out as well.
Correct. There are reasons. So it turns out that's the most simplistic mechanism that's actually going on in that instance. And so that's why if you work out, it works. And it actually, resistance training amplifies the effect that you experience. It turns out if you keep insulin levels at, homeostatic baseline in the first half of the day, you get some really great effects. You get HSL, which is hormone-sensitive lipase, actually will activate in fat cells, which allows them to release more fat. And LPL, which is lipoprotein lipase, also in fat cells, deactivates, which is what allows fat to be stored in fat cells. So by not having carbohydrates, pretty much, and you could just say ever, if you never ate carbohydrates, fat cells actually become triggered to try to release more fat than they store. So you can get this through the first half of the day, and muscles are actually the opposite. When muscles don't have insulin, then they actually switch and they try to absorb fatty acids to use them for energy. So during the first half of the day, if you limit insulin, if you limit the amount of carbohydrates you ingest and you limit insulin load, then you actually are setting your body up to be a fat burner and, more importantly, a fat mobilizer. I think that's where a lot of people get confused because there's all kinds of ways to burn fat, but that doesn't mean you're mobilizing body fat. So it's very key. We're trying to keep insulin low in the first part of the day to give our body an opportunity to mobilize body fat for energy. And in doing that, then at night, when we're more insulin insensitive, we still have a predisposition to dispose of those carbohydrates in ways other than body fat. So even without resistance training, you can still get healthful benefits from moving your carbohydrates to later in the evening. And basically resistance training or some sort of power production training essentially is what I call it. So CrossFit would fit into that. Resistance training fits into that. Even body weight exercise will fit into that. That just amplifies the effect.
Now, do you see difference between a lot of people, for example, have busy jobs, so 9 to 5 they work, and they have to kind of squeeze in a workout in the morning time? Do you see a more beneficial timing of working out? Because
for myself right now at the moment, I'm semi competing in powerlifting, and based on my circadian rhythms and my hormones, my peak performance is usually around 3 p.m., give or take, right?
Okay.
You know, compared to if I'm trying to train at like 9 a.m. So I'm seeing if there's any kind of like optimal time. If you have the luxury of choosing your workout time, would you say morning versus afternoon?
If you have the luxury, then afternoon is better. And you kind of nailed it. Most people's circadian rhythms actually allow them to be stronger at night. The nervous system's has a higher level of activation, and your body temperature is slightly elevated, so your rate of perceived exertion is less. So the evening is always the kind of ideal time to train anyway. And you've naturally kind of hit on that. You found 3 o'clock as your sweet spot. And any time in those hours through the evening, that's a great time to resistance train. And you're really in the sweet spot because it can take several hours for that it's called GLUT 4 translocation. It can take several hours for that GLUT 4 to fully come to the surface of muscle cells to absorb glucose at its maximum rate. So if you trained at 3 or 4 and then you're eating carbohydrates at 6 or 7, you're in that ideal window of amplifying the effects of carb backloading for your training.
Awesome. And you mentioned because you found all the studies in diabetic literature, and I was looking at some diabetic literature myself, and I found that resistance training, as you just mentioned, as well activates GLUT4 receptors, right?
Correct.
So you're getting like a double benefit over here. You're getting the timing benefit, and as well now you're getting the external resistant training benefit.
Yes, exactly. And there's one more benefit we haven't actually talked about, which usually when you take, especially strength athletes or any kind of athlete who's working towards a strength goal, and you take carbohydrates out of the first half of the day before their training, you see this really rapid rise in strength. And the muscle itself, the strength density of the muscle hasn't really changed. What's happened is that if insulin is low in the system at those baseline levels, then, well, let's go backwards. If insulin's elevated, it's very interesting because when insulin levels are elevated, your body actually won't let you access internal muscle glycogen stores or any internal energy stores. It tries to subsist entirely on what's being fed to it through the circulatory system. So it relies most heavily on what you just ingested. So there's this rate limiting problem that you could run into. We aren't able to mobilize glycogen as effectively as we can. So we're really rate limited on how fast energy can get into our muscles from what we're ingesting. And that's why you'll see people, not only do they eat before they work out, they try to eat all through their workout too. Well, if you take insulin away, then you just opened the floodgates for all of that internal energy. Your glycogen stores are now highly accessible, and that's due to be able to utilize intramuscular glycogen, then you need to be sensitive to adrenaline, all those stress hormones. Well, if you work out and you haven't had any carbohydrates yet that day, you get a bigger stress response in a good way. You get a quicker stress response in a good way, and your muscles are more sensitive to that stress response. So you get this immediate boost in performance just by making that small change in when you eat your carbohydrates.
Yeah, I find it fascinating though, because if we look at like evolution of humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
We didn't necessarily have access to a fridge during the day, right? So
Right.
there's no fridge. So, maybe the women out there had to go gather maybe nuts, berries, whatever they can get their hands on, and the men had to go hunt. So it took you the whole day to gather all this nutritious food. That being said, I'm wondering if we ended up eating more or less later in the afternoon, and we actually never ate throughout the day.
Yeah, there's a lot of conjecture there, because you can look at, so for example, the human eye has its sharpest resolution at dusk. So the argument could be made that we really only ever hunted at night. And you're right, we didn't have a refrigerator, and we knew that the kill wouldn't last very long. So we very likely could have been eating a lot of food at night. And any food that we had during the day, you're right, would have been gathered and scavenged and probably consumed either right before or with whatever kill we might have made.
Yeah, I find it fascinating though on many counts. And as well, this kind of ties into, you mentioned earlier, and I'm a big proponent as well myself, is the ketogenic diet. Now, you found a way that you combined having carbs, but yet you can be on like a cyclic ketogenic protocol and combine best of both worlds.
Yes, that is the idea, and that's a really interesting piece of the puzzle that I've been working on. And actually, one reason I came out to Phoenix was to start to look at a lot of what happens in the blood ketone levels during these type of diets, because we actually don't have a lot of research on that, and we don't have a lot of people looking into it. So the question is, some people I've worked with, their ketone levels never really go above the 0.3 millimolar range, which is very, very low. That's basically
really low,
what,
yeah,
that's what everybody is in if you're eating carbohydrates. And what we would like to see is people in that first half of the day up to at least 3 millimolar range. And that, happens sometimes, but sometimes it doesn't. But even in the people that it doesn't happen, they still see a lot of benefits from the diet. So it's kind of interesting to figure out why they're seeing the benefits, and also why some people can't get into that ketogenic state, because ketones, oh my gosh, they turn on so many beneficial processes. It's ridiculous. So we would like to see high ketone levels at some point during the day.
Yeah, I wonder if it has to do with like epigenetic expressions and maybe certain liver enzymes that help you produce hydroxybutyrate. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I've actually been looking at a lot of what's going on. It's interesting. You keep leading me into things I've been looking at recently, like all the metabolic chains in the liver. And, there could actually be some deficiencies there. There could also be, what I'm starting to see a correlation. It's not very strong, and I don't, have hard numbers for it yet, but I'd like to get them. People who have more body fat and seem to lose the body fat faster are the ones who are the most resistant to going into ketosis. And what we could be seeing there is they're mobilizing a lot of body fat from body fat stores, and the glycerol flux is high enough that those 3-carbon glycerol molecules are recombining rather efficiently in the liver to glucose, and therefore stymieing the pathways to create more ketones. It's hard to say, but that like I said, there's a lot of questions here. What we have is literally 30,000 plus people who've gotten these phenomenal results with carb backloading. And then when we go backwards, like, okay, when we look at some of these people, not everything's working the way it should, and yet they're still getting results. So there's obviously some missing mechanisms.
I even see other ones. They have like a hypothesis. I forget what species they're talking about though, but if you're keto adapted, you're more or less prevalent in XYZ bacteria that help you create, hydroxybutyrate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or if you're carb adapted, these are your species in your bacteria. They haven't conclusively come to an understanding of that, but that's an interesting perspective. And that kind of ties in with the whole aspect of the whole biohacks they're doing these days with resistant starch. So if you're having, for example, right, like good carbs at nighttime, maybe they have like RS2 or 3 inside of it. A, you're feeding your bacteria. B, maybe you're giving your body a good boost of serotonin for melatonin for circadian cycle. And all of this is kind of like a really good stew, I would say, for your ecosystem of your body in every shape and form.
It could be. I'm a little skeptical of the resistant starch myself at the moment. The more research I look into it, the more skeptical I keep becoming. So I won't comment too much on the resistant starch theories at the moment. But you're right. The type of that's highly ignored, and something I'm trying to help bring into the performance community. And it's a little slow, but we need to feed our bodies, but we also need to feed the bacteria living inside of us and feed it appropriately. And I think that's the message that's being taken in the direction of resistant starch. I just don't think resistant starch is a very effective fuel at feeding the right bacteria in the right way. and more importantly, getting the right bacteria to colonize.
Yeah, my problem with resistant starch is people jumping on like that powders instead of the actual whole foods. That's my beef with it. Like if you're gonna have resistant starch, I'm saying just eat the food. For example,
Right.
potatoes, sweet potatoes. Actually eat what nature is giving you.
See, that would make sense, right?
Not then me going to like my local nut
Right.
store or something and getting this weird powder that probably comes from China, to tell you the truth. I have no idea where it comes from.
Right. Yeah, but that would make too much sense to actually eat real food. I mean, where's the fun in that?
Well, there's no fun.
Right. Right.
So that's really interesting. Now, how does this tie into, for example, you mentioning earlier, you're talking about diabetics. How would you say a diabetic, say type 2, would approach the whole carb backloading system?
Type 2 diabetics, so, this is very important, and a lot of my critics with carb backloading use a lot of data from insulin resistant and type 2 diabetics to say that I'm wrong. And, what they don't understand, and really their argument only shows their ignorance, because what we have with type 2 diabetics is they are very, very different. For example, we have the insulin paradox, we call it, with type 2 diabetics and those who are strongly insulin resistant. And that is that first thing in the morning, they have large insulin responses and they're highly insulin sensitive. This is actually, insulin resistant first thing in the morning. So we call it the insulin paradox because they have a higher insulin surge in the morning, but they're more insulin resistant in the morning, and actually their insulin sensitivity goes up slightly through the day. This is only in diabetic populations. So they're actually opposite of a healthy individual. And we also have a very, very different paradigm at the cellular level. Type 2 diabetics have in normal healthy human beings, we have very little of what's called the GLUT5 transporter in fat cells and muscle cells. GLUT5 very specifically transports fructose into the muscle. And your cells can use fructose to produce energy to get into the Krebs cycle. But it usually doesn't, because glucose has such a stronger binding and affinity for the enzymes necessary. But they're diabetic. They can't get glucose into the cells. So what happens is those cells overexpress, or they show a lot of GLUT5 transporters so that they can absorb fructose. So we've got this, like, literally type 2 diabetics, you could argue metabolically are completely different from a healthy human being. So really the default treatment, and I've talked to Dr. Richard Feynman, who's at SUNY Downstate Medical University, about this, and we're both adamantly agreed that the default diet for a type 2 diabetic is a ketogenic diet, period. They should not be introducing carbohydrates very often at all into their diet, at most once per week, and at the least once every 3 to 4 weeks. So carb backloading really is not an acceptable paradigm for them, other than if it's very, very difficult for them to go ketogenic. They will see some benefits from carb backloading, but not to the extreme of a healthier individual.
I agree 100%. The ketogenic diet for 99.99% of the type 2 diabetics out there is golden. Now, would you say timing of workouts for a type 2 diabetic would be in the range of in the morning or the afternoon? Like, once again, because you were mentioned before, a healthy individual would be optimal in the afternoon because of circadian hormone response. But now, since you're type 2 diabetic, your pancreas isn't working very well, you have insulin issues, would you say generally if you just work out, period, it's just a win-win? Or if you have the opportunity, if you can pick your time, which time would that be?
I think pretty much if they just work out, period, it's win-win. Because, you're looking at a situation where you want to try to not introduce carbohydrates for them. And if you put them on a ketogenic diet, they're going to have large glycerol flux, which means they are going to be producing glucose from those body fat stores. So if they're working out at any time during the day, you're helping them to decrease that glucose load, which means that they can increase glycerol flux, which means they can increase fatty acid flux, which means they can decrease body fat even faster. So just resistance training period for them. Doesn't matter what time of day. They just need to get it in.
I agree 100%. Okay, now switching gears. Let's say you're an athlete. Let's say you're an athlete. Now you're on the opposite spectrum, right? So if you're
Okay.
like a power lifter, Olympic lifter, or whatever athlete, MMA fighter, how would one approach the whole carb loading system?
It's really actually simple, and a lot of people try to make it difficult, but it's really you would very, very strongly limit carbohydrates for the first half of your day. So we'll just pretend that we don't know when they're training yet, and then we'll talk about the training component in a second. So for the first half of your day, and we'll say, or more than the first half of the day, we'll say until 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. at night. Your diet is going to consist mostly of high-fat, lower protein foods, no carbohydrates. So by that, you could look at, hamburgers fried in butter is, some people use. What quote-unquote healthier options are salads with a lot of chicken, cheese, and some oil. If you're not totally paleo, then you can scratch the cheese and throw in avocado. Things like that where the protein load is smaller and we're getting a lot of fats in that first half of the day. And we want to stay away from protein supplements. Those really are going to kind of nullify any chance we have of becoming ketogenic by using those. And then in the evening is the time when you would have any protein shakes you want to have to make up for a protein deficit. You can go ahead and eat your carbohydrates, sweet potatoes, French fries. You can be a little dirtier than normal. But white rice is another good one. White rice with honey turns out to be a favorite amongst a lot of people who do this.
Why is that?
Because they get the starch and then they get a sweetness too, and it's not something like Pop-Tarts. It's something that's palatable to them that they enjoy.
Have you seen a connection with like Manuka honey and sleeping circadian sleep schedule?
No, I have not.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people report, and they talk about this at the Bulletproof Forum. A lot of people do say a teaspoon of Manuka honey at nighttime notice really, really better improved sleep. Like they hit the REM sleep, they wake up refreshed. I'm not too sure the mechanisms behind it. I don't know if we know, tell you the truth, but it's something fascinating.
Huh. Well, that could be an interesting adjunct then that fits in nicely with carb backloading.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Now,
Yeah.
Is there any kind of like problems for, say, a bodybuilder? Because bodybuilders are looking for hypertrophic growth. They want to expand their muscles as, humanly possible. So can they benefit from carb backloading?
It really depends on the state they're in. And this is also a problem with powerlifters. So, I work with powerlifters. So bodybuilders are already pretty lean, or they should be. And then a nice comparison on the flip side is some powerlifters that I worked with who were actually carried a lot of body fat. And what they found was by carb backloading just those few hours at night, they dropped a lot of body fat and then they hit a plateau. And bodybuilders experience the same thing. If they've got a lot of muscle mass, that just few meals at night is not going to be enough carbohydrates to replenish them. So there's a couple different scenarios that can work there. They can do something like if they need to introduce carbs earlier in the day to meet these hypertrophic goals, then they can do what I call glycemic backloading. So that first part of the day, you're trying to go for very low glycemic carbohydrates. And then after whenever your training is, or at night, is when you go for the more high glycemic carbohydrates. So I call that glycemic backloading, and still the optimum procedure is for that breakfast time, which breakfast could extend to, say all the way your first meal maybe is at 8 or 9 or something like that. So that morning window, you still want to stay as free of carbohydrates as possible. But go ahead.
Are you familiar with the anabolic diet? He's passing my mind.
Deep Pasquale?
Yes.
Yes, I am. That was actually His book is what got me interested in ketogenic diets in the first place, way back in the 90s.
Now, what's your take on his aspect or his viewpoint of not having carbs after a workout? So, say if you have, say, a power lifter and you're having your workout later on in the evening or afternoon, are you on that notion that if you can stretch your carbohydrates, have them a little bit further from your post-workout meal?
That's kind of interesting because you do have several hours before there's full activation of the GLUT4, but you also have this window immediately post-training where your body is still in a catabolic state. And what you want to try to do is soften that catabolic state as much as possible or eliminate it, which carbohydrates are very effective at doing that because they spike insulin levels. So, it's really going to depend on your goal and what you find works best for you. Most of the time, I usually say when you're done with your workout, wait at least 30 minutes and then ingest whatever your post-workout shakes are going to be. And then later in night, do whatever. And that's really going to be for the serious gainers. For people who really are just working out to look better in the gym, sometimes I tell them just have a glass of milk with some salt as their post-workout shake.
Why the salt?
Just to get a good electrolyte profile to make sure they replete. It works really well. It's easy on their stomach, and it's pretty much got all you need, and it's got casein protein in it, so that's going to give you a long-lived or a long-tail anabolic response.
Now, have you seen the studies on, say, you work out and then you don't take anything? For example, no milk, no salt, no food for at least an hour, that supposedly it does increase growth hormone potential.
I've seen reference to those studies. I've not actually read those studies. So the question there is what does that actually mean?
Exactly.
In my mind? So, right. Because there's always ways to spike growth hormone release, which, intermittent fasting is one of those. But over the short term, it only lasts for the first week of intermittent fasting, and it absolutely makes no difference on how much body fat you lose in long-term studies. So I'm always, whenever the conversation of growth hormone comes up, I'm always kind of curious of how it fits into everything. And my take on it is, that growth hormone response, really what you want that for is just overall health and plasticity of the system. So example, it helps to keep all the cells of your body healthier, essentially. So I'll just reserve comment on that growth hormone response question.
Awesome. So I'm just curious though now, if your goal is just strictly strength, for example, you mentioned powerlifters, and a lot of them were carrying extra weight, and they took the carb backloading system, they lost some weight. Have you found a sweet spot for powerlifters? Let's just talk about powerlifters because I'm doing that at the moment. Have you found a sweet spot that really works well for powerlifters?
There's a general prescription, and that's really around your leading up to your training sessions. Of course, your no carbohydrates whatsoever, and then eating your carbohydrates at the dinner time. So you're in the sweet spot of training. So you can have whatever you want post-training, a good shake immediately after. And this is going to go contrary to things I've said before, but protein powders with MCT oil or coconut oil is a great post-workout shake without a lot of carbs. And then
that's fascinating. I just want to pause for a second because I was talking to Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, I think it was 2 weeks ago. I had him on my show as well. And he was doing the research with the Navy SEALs, ketone adaptation for oxygen, as well, supplementation. I think it's called Keto Force. And we were talking about, optimal performance, we're talking about Navy SEALs, etc., that they found that post ingestion of external ketones, so right now you mentioned MCT oil, has found to be significantly beneficial for protein synthesis, and as well, on the side note, to increase antioxidant capacity within your body.
Yeah, I've actually talked to Dom as well. That guy is brilliant. So
yeah.
yeah. So yeah, and what I found working with a lot of the powerlifters specifically and the exhaustive loads that they were often handling, is that introducing carbohydrates after the workout was causing a lot of stomach distress. So they actually had glucose intolerance, which the easiest way to mitigate that was to just not have the carbohydrates after they worked out and instead have this combination of MCTs and protein powder, sometimes milk, which worked really well for them. And then later in the evening is when they would do their carbohydrate load. So that's kind of the sweet spot. And then game day, when you have your powerlifting meet, ideally, if you can be empty of food when you start your first round of lifts, you're going to perform way better.
I agree 100%. So we mentioned earlier about intermittent fasting. Now, I looked at some old studies from the USSR and Bulgarian Olympic weightlifters where they had a really unique approach of having IF a couple of times throughout the week, and they're showing great gains. Now, what's your take on it? You mentioned earlier there is a point of diminishing returns.
Yeah, so if I'm just going to say I'm not a proponent of intermittent fasting. I think everything that intermittent fasting does can actually be amplified and enhanced with carb backloading. So intermittent fasting is kind of like the poor man's carb backloading. You don't if you don't understand how the body works at the cellular level, then your best guess is going to be intermittent fasting. If you take it a next step further and say, okay, what is it that intermittent fasting is doing at the metabolic level and then also systemically, then you can tweak it and enhance it. And it turns out tweaking it and enhancing it gives you carb backloading. But so the intermittent fasting studies, I'm not familiar with the Russian research, and I'm always a little skeptical of their research. But what we see is after a couple weeks of intermittent fasting, even these 24-hour fasts once a week or twice a week, is all the beneficial responses we saw initially are totally ablated. They're just gone. So, you've got 2 weeks of benefit from intermittent fasting. So if you wanted to, your ideal prescription would be, say, once every couple months, take a couple weeks, and for 2 weeks, just pick one day and don't eat for 24 hours. You might get some benefit then. But even that's completely speculative.
Yeah, I think it also matters on an individual basis. A lot of people have hypoglycemic periods. They have a lot of other metabolic issues. And I've seen people literally, they couldn't go 6 hours without eating and they just fall apart.
Yeah, people, that's another nice thing about carb backloading is you are ingesting some food that allows your body to at least get some satiety signals, and carbohydrates that most people are coming from, they're coming from a carb-based diet, really program your hunger signal. So all of a sudden you're taking this strong programming signal and you removed it, and your body is still staying on that track, and you're not eating anything, so there's nothing to help you follow the program that your body is now on, which makes it very, very difficult to reprogram it.
Yeah. Now, I'm pretty sure the audience is right now scratching their head and wondering, what is Kiefer and Ameer talking about, this whole carb backloading? It's kind of hard to comprehend. Let's kind of open the veil over here and kind of explain what carbs are we talking about in the first place? Because it's very generalization. I know you talk about before French fries. I even heard you say before ice cream. So let's just lay it out before. What types of carbs should be on a scale to ideally you should aim for these, but you also have the option of these.
So the prescription I usually give, so just to break it down really simple, you're just not eating carbohydrates the first half of the day, eating a lot of fat, and then you're in the evening and you need to decide what carbohydrates are going to be the best options for you. It really depends on the amount of body fat you have and the amount of muscle mass you have. If you are not very muscular, then you really want to limit your carbohydrate types to, whole foods will work fine, but you need to find ways to get a good insulin response, which means you're going to look for the white starches. And you're going to look for very well cooked tubers and not making them partially raw or undercooked. Those are going to be some of your best bets. White rice is a great one. Add things to sweeten it up. Now, if you want to get a bigger response with a smaller amount of food, you could go for things like Fruity Pebbles, which I always claim is paleo because obviously if the Flintstones ate it, then it must be paleo. So, fruity. Some people use fruity, like a bowl of Fruity Pebbles is what they use to kind of cap their carb backloading because it gives them a really nice insulin response and they don't have to eat a lot of it. As you get bigger, as you get more and more muscle mass, then you can get away with what I call the junk carbs, things like donuts, ice cream, pizza. You can get away with a lot more food. And in general, no matter what size you are, you can get away with food like that once or twice a week.
The only
But
problem I have with that is, once or twice a week, sure. Do you ever find that some people may not have the willpower the very next day to say no to those types of foods throughout the day? That's my only issue I see is like, it may not have no issues, may be beneficial, but then like it breaks that like habitual autoplay system in your mind.
oddly enough, that doesn't happen very often. Usually people are right back to normal first thing in the morning. They can get up and they can be right back on track. I have seen it a few times, but it's very, very rare, and it's more likely to happen with the other dieting paradigm that I have, which is called Carb Night, where they only eat carbohydrates at most one night per week, period. That I've seen where if people use junk carbs on that paradigm, then they risk the possibility of not being able to stop themselves the next day.
Yeah, that's the only thing I've seen in my practice as well is like the cheat days, by all means, we're humans. If you got to go out and socialize, have some fun. But
Hmm.
when they go for that cheat day, it's like all hell breaks loose. It's like, rah! they,
Yeah,
they gorge on everything. But the problem with that, it becomes a catalyst. And the next day, it's hard to break that because it's a
right.
sugar addiction too. Sugar is very addictive.
Right. Well, and it has long-term consequences. We think of, well, we eat some food and maybe it affects us for a few hours, but we've got great research now that the food, what you eat before you go to bed, carbohydrate-wise, can actually not only influence your hunger signals the next morning, but it can influence how your body reacts to what you eat the next morning. So we have to take those things into account. Especially for someone that might have some sort of compromised system, might be slightly insulin resistant, which if you are a male in the United States over the age of 25, odds are you suffer some sort of insulin resistance.
Oh, for sure. Now, I'm wondering on a different mechanism over here. You're eating carbs, give or take, around the evening time. Obviously, it's spiking insulin, it's spiking your cortisol a little bit. I'm wondering how does this kind of tie into the circadian sleep cycle? Because if we're looking at from like a black and white point of view, we would say that it's not good to spike insulin in the evening because it may disrupt cortisol, which disrupts melatonin, right? So
Right.
how have you find, or should I rephrase this? Have you found anything in the literature or maybe even from observational point of view that kind of indicates no, it's beneficial to spike insulin and have a little bit cortisol at nighttime because it equals X, Y, and Z?
Well, it's kind of a interesting conversation because that's one of my arguments for you want the high glycemic, fast reacting carbs because you want an insulin spike and you want it to subside as quickly as possible. And this does a couple things. A, it will clear the blood glucose more quickly. And then B, higher insulin response actually for a shorter period of time can be far more beneficial than long-tailed insulin response. And then C, what we have is when we're going to sleep, we want those insulin levels to go back down to normal as quickly as possible. And we get a couple effects there. As long as like growth hormone and cortisol actually won't start to release in their normal cycle until an hour after insulin has fallen back to baseline levels. So we don't want to be eating all the way to bedtime is the first thing. And then the second thing is there's actually a spark of serotonin production if you've been without carbohydrates for several hours. So you can actually get potentially better sleep at night. So this is an interesting thing because some people report better sleep and others report horrible sleep.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. I've noticed the same
yeah,
thing. Yeah.
and usually those who have the horrible sleep, what's interesting is their body temperature just skyrockets at night.
Mm.
So they're having some, metabolic episode where their thermogenesis is just through the roof, which screws everything up. And that's just, people kind of find their sweet spot with the foods, which usually balances between slightly lower glycemic natural foods and then maybe once a week when they don't have to worry about what's happening the next day is when they'll have whatever small amount of junk they desire.
Yeah, I was always curious for those people who had carbs later in the evening that their sleep is horrible. Maybe upregulates thyroid metabolism or T3 or T4. But you're right, you hit the nail in the coffin. Their internal body temperature just skyrockets.
Yeah. Yeah, they wake up all sweaty and hot and they've got to turn on the fan. It could be several things. You could have a surge in thyroid hormone, which is going to cause a lot of uncoupling protein 1 to upregulate, and then your thermogenesis is going to go through the roof, which, just means you had a large influx of energy that your body couldn't necessarily dispose of in any other way other than to just burn it off as heat. And that can also be exacerbated by rising cortisol levels. So without data to see what's going on with hormone and, blood markers through the night, it's really hard to say what the cause is and what the best solution would be.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It goes back to self-quantifying it. Try it, see how you react. If you benefit from it, fantastic. If you don't, well, back to the drawing board.
Right, exactly.
Now, let's wrap this up. So, to summarize, we'll do this once again so everyone can really grasp the notion what we're talking about is avoiding carbohydrates throughout the day. If you have the luxury, doing your training later in the evening or the afternoon, and then at nighttime having wholesome whole food carbs, and you feel kind of naughty, you can have some of the ice creams and other stuff you mentioned, right?
Correct.
Awesome. Well, that's amazing. That's simple. It's not really
It
complicated
is.
at all.
Right. It doesn't have to be made complicated, and everybody tries to complicate it. It's really not. The reasoning for all of it working might be somewhat complicated, but the procedure itself is pretty simple.
Well, at the end of the day, I don't think so. People really want to know the mechanics behind it. They want to know, does this help me or not?
That's exact. Will this make me more awesome?
Exactly. Instead of calling it like carb backloading, we should call it the most awesome way to improve your health. That's it.
Could just call it the awesome diet.
The awesome diet. Oh, that would sell like $1 million. The awesome diet. Trademark it. Awesome, Kiefer. Well, where can people find more information about you and about carb backloading, aka the awesomeness?
I'm kind of in a state of flux. Carb backloading can be found at carbbackloading.com, all one word. Carb Night, another one of my books that you can learn kind of about my philosophies, can be found at carbnight.com, and that's NITE, all one word. My old website is athlete.io. You can find a lot of my older articles on there, and there's links to around the web. And my new website, which has not launched, which will be the new hub for everything, is body.io. So just, keep checking that out every once in a while. It will launch pretty soon, early this year.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Kiefer, for coming on the show and educating us about carb backloading. Till we meet again, have an amazing day.
You too. Thanks, Ameer.
And that wraps up episode 40 with John Kiefer and carb backloading. Now, if you haven't done it already, Optimal Health Warriors, please head over to www.ameerrosic.com/iTunes and leave a review. The more reviews we have, the more Optimal Health Warriors we can make globally. And I have a dream. My dream is to create 1 billion, yes, would it be 1 billion Optimal Health Warriors worldwide. And together, we truly can make a difference. So I wish you all an amazing week. Catch you soon.